All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to episode 16 of Crazy Talk. If this is your first time tuning into Crazy Talk, I am your host, Lee Thomas. Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show where we talk about all sorts of stuff related to mental health. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I'm glad we haven't scared you off yet. So like I said, my name's Lee Thomas and I'm your host. We're going to start off this show with a shout out. I want to give a shout out to the Department of Social Development with the government of New Brunswick. They just wrapped up 5 mental health first aid trainings. All with me, which obviously in my very biased opinion went super well. And I just really think it's great that the government of New Brunswick is making that commitment. In our crazy good news section, I am going to be heading to Bonar Law Memorial High School in Rexton. So I'm super excited to be doing that. That'll be this Thursday, and we'll be talking about mental health stigma, story sharing, all that kind of good stuff. So that's enough about me for now. Now I want to introduce our incredible guest. So this week on Crazy Talk, we have Shireen Ahmed, who is a writer, public speaker, and sports activist who focuses on Muslim women and the intersections of racism and misogyny in sports. Her work has been featured and discussed in various media outlets. She is part of the Burn It All Down feminist sports podcast team, which I totally recommend you checking out, and we'll put some links to in the comments down below. When Shireen isn't watching soccer, she drinks coffee as a tool of resistance. Shireen is currently working on her first book. She lives in Mississauga with her family and her cat, and we will put links to her Twitter account and her website in the comments as well. Shireen, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Hi, Lee. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really glad to have you. So I guess I was going to say for those of you who don't know, although I'm not sure why anyone would know this, Shireen and I met at a journalism conference in Fredericton 2 years ago, maybe?
2 years ago. Yep.
Yeah, and I've just been, fanboying over you on Twitter ever since. So I'm really excited to have you on the show.
And likewise, that was an incredible thing that we experienced. I had a lot of, that panel is particularly one of my favorites because we talked about, and very correlated to Crazy Talk, we talked about abuse that we suffer online and how that can trigger our own mental health struggles much of the time. I remember it was a very profound, it was pretty great to be there and share that experience.
Yeah, it was quite an intense panel, I remember.
It was. I don't think we started off that way. I know we moved furniture. I remember this, but I benefited greatly from that experience. So it stuck with me.
Oh, I'm glad. So some people who are watching Crazy Talk right now, I can't speak for everyone, but my background in sports, I was a varsity athlete, but I was a wrestler, which not the coolest varsity sport by any means. But I was a wrestler, so I had my own mental health struggles, and I always thought of that as a very uniquely individual me thing, because I think there is this kind of idea out there that athletes are all mentally tough. And you talked about that on the Burn It All Down episode that I was listening to. So do you want to talk a little bit about kind of that idea around mental health in sports? Because some people who are tuning in might even be like, mental health and sports are two different worlds. Why are we talking about them, in the same conversation?
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that, we have a tendency to separate athletes in the sports world from things like that are stigmatized or unpopular, and mental health is definitely a really good example of that, particularly because we have a tendency to dehumanize athletes much of the time, and coaches and whatnot, because they're at this level where they're in the spotlight. And, because social media and everything you see on social media is absolutely beautiful and perfect, right? It's also because of the fact that mental health struggles and issues of mental illness are so stigmatized that people in those roles that are often considered role models might shy away from being honest. Like, as of late, we've seen really powerful voices of athletes speaking up. And what that does is that it's unfortunate that we have to normalize this, because it is absolutely normal and a natural part of so many people's experiences that they struggle. And so we've seen, athletes talk about it. One of the most profound, I'm not going to say profound, because we could get into another discussion how women, non-binary folk that aren't even recognized in mainstream sports media, that's a whole other episode of Crazy Talk. But the reality is that Toronto Raptors player DeMar DeRozan just put out a tweet talking about how depression was affecting him, and it went viral so quickly because it's very infrequently that we see athletes that are as prominent talk about something so easily and freely. And, there's a lot of issues that we see with toxic masculinity in there, and how depictions of what strong men should look like. And so it complicates, like, it's a very complicated and complex thing. But what ended up happening is that his tweet ended up encouraging another basketball player named Kevin Love to write a very, very sincere, beautiful sort of narrative in the Players Tribune, which also went viral, because again, we still don't see enough professional athletes or even amateur athletes talking about this in those positions, ones that are at they're NBA stars. And that was really important. What was overlooked is that there are WNBA stars, like on our show, Burn It All Down. Imani McGee-Stafford was actually on our show talking about this exact thing, but she's, a Black woman, so she's not going to get the spotlight that Kevin Love will get. But she talked about this. She's a great advocate for mental health. I remember we had a segment many weeks ago on Burn It All Down, and I'm terrible. I can't remember the episode number. I should be able to remember the episode number, because we all talked about an athlete that affected us as sports writers and sports enthusiasts. And for me, it was a Canadian oarswoman named Silken Lauman. And I don't know if your, listeners or viewers would remember, but she actually wrote a book about her struggle with anxiety. And as someone who struggles with anxiety, she wrote about that and how that affected her, that it was a secret that she didn't share and she didn't realize what it was. And she talked about her own mother, probably an undiagnosed, sufferer with mental health issues. And for me, that was incredibly profound, that she was so open about it and what she had experienced. And this is a woman who I thought was like indomitable, but we're not. And much later, when she came up with her book, it made me love and respect her even more for talking about that in the first place. And but we didn't see a lot of it in the media. Again, I'm not sure if it's because she identifies as a woman or like what it is. Like, she's also a mother, but these stories, like, they're already being spoken of certain circles, particularly around women of color having these conversations, but it doesn't get amplified, right? So, and especially in the sports where the default is a white straight man. So, I mean, so those conversations are happening, and I see more of them. Like, now I see more of them. Like, I can't imagine when I was like younger or like, a teenager or in my early 20s seeing this anywhere. I didn't see it. I simply didn't see it. It doesn't mean it didn't exist. It just meant that it was so taboo.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought up Silken Lauman, because I had the great privilege of seeing her speak at the National Conference on Peer Support maybe 2 years ago, I think, in Toronto, in that ballpark. Yeah. And I, like, she was introduced as, this big deal in athletics in the Olympics in Canada, and I was like, this was before my time. I don't remember this, because I'm
much older than you are, Lee.
But what I loved about her presentation was, because I work a lot with eating disorders, and those often go, they run rampant in athletic communities, but no one kind of talks about it. And she really set the audience up for this, which I loved, because she was talking about, she was going through a really rough time, and so I think she had gotten a divorce, and she was deciding to like lose a little bit of weight to just, and then she talked about, I want to lose the love handles or whatever. And she was like, so, I went on a diet and I lost 10 pounds, and like people in the audience clapped. And then she was kind of like, and then I lost 20 pounds, and then I lost 30 pounds, and the clapping slowed down. Oh, right. Because people were kind of like, oh, I now realize that, like, and I just love that she had kind of set us up to realize our own biases in that way, because we do, whether it's in the athletic community or beyond, we do have this, weight loss is inherently good, and, it's a result of discipline and all that kind of stuff. And so that like made me a fan for life. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised she does that. She faces these things with so much gusto and so much confidence and so much sincerity. And for me, reading her memoir was really, really poignant, because one of the things gets lost is anxiety in the discussions. People focus around depression and whatnot, but people don't know how crippling anxiety can be. And, it goes part and parcel with other things, and particularly her talking about eating disorders. Like, I have no expertise like you do, but just understanding there's so many points at which these intersect.
Yeah.
And for her to say that, and you're right, the default is always like, I know many years ago when not many, but when I struggled with depression, I lost a lot of weight. Everyone's like, oh, you look so great. And I'm like, no, I don't. Like, I don't. And in so much that I had a friend say to me later, what can we do about this? And that's what it took for me to say. And it's because I was struggling, not because I was succeeding, that happened. And, just sort of having someone recognize. And then we get into this discussion, getting back to athletes. Even the physicians that they work with and the sports people are so in tune to having them be at their best physical self physically in terms of what they look like and how long they can run and their cardio levels and their stamina levels. But like, are they really checking into what their mental health is? Like, we see that happening now. And I know that some professional women's soccer teams like NWSL and stuff, they're doing that as a part of the like holistic health, which is so important. And I know that in the CWHL, the Canadian Women's Hockey League, there absolutely are discussions about mental health happening. But again, it's a league run by women for women. And so you see the kind of difference, like the mainstream is not there yet, right? So that affects things. And also because there'll always be a part of society that rejects mental health as a part of overall health, sadly. And because it's not something you see. If there's an athlete or a person out there, amateur athlete or a student athlete out there high performing well, it doesn't mean that when there's battling mental health, they can't be high performers. And that's where it sort of gets in that those panic attacks or those anxiety attacks or those struggles, the loss of sleep, the loss of appetite, you can't necessarily pinpoint that and see it. And often it's not overt. So they're in a place where, they're surrounded by expectations that are so physical that the mental emotional takes a back seat, sadly, and is not. So, I think that having these discussions are so important. And, the Bell Let's Talk, which is being, sort of forwarded by Cassie Campbell, I have critiques of that because it does exclude very much in marginalized communities, whether they're people of color or LGBTIQ or persons with disabilities. In that way, non-mental health disabilities, like they get excluded from the conversation, I find. But there is benefit to having that openly, because what it does, you have someone formidable who is talking about it publicly and sharing like helpline numbers, offering practical steps one can take. And that does, I think there is benefit to that. So, I mean, that's just sort of where I see it. But things like this, and when you have, athletes coming out and just making statements and in their interviews are saying, oh, that was really tough, or I found that really challenging. Even language is really important around this, and getting the language right around this and not being ableist in how you talk about it, and having people that don't struggle and not be ableist, So there's all these things to sort of keep in mind, and they're not, I know that sounds like a huge list, but it's not. It's really not that difficult.
Yeah, and a lot of it boils down to, and I was watching a couple of the other interviews that you've done and in preparing for this, and you talked about compassion, right? And like how a lot of it does really boil down to compassion. And I think people maybe struggle with that in especially kind of the professional sports world. And not that I can really speak to that, but as, because you talked about how, we do often dehumanize athletes, and compassion is all about making the vulnerable choice to identify humanly with other people. Right. And sometimes, so I grew up in a small town in northern Alberta, a little place called Whitecourt. Yeah. And athletes, particularly like hockey players, were like superstars, right? Whether they were hockey players in our school or like NHL players, the Edmonton Oilers, it was a huge deal. And I remember when the Oilers, this is not necessarily mental health related, but when the Oilers made the decision to march in Edmonton Pride. And I remember how important that was to me, because it was that whole, starting the conversation. Like, is it a perfect finish to the conversation? Absolutely not. Like, in the same way Bell Let's Talk isn't, right? Like, I wrote an article a couple of years ago where it was called Why I Hate Bell Let's Talk, but Why I Do It Every Year. And it kind of went like, you know, I don't think it gets the whole picture. I think it does exclude a lot of voices. But if I think back to, you know, some version of myself growing up still in small town northern Alberta, where those conversations are just beginning in a lot of ways, how, you know, someone like an athlete speaking about something like mental health can really be eye-opening for people.
Oh, absolutely. And I think your article is too. I pay attention to Bell Let's Talk every year. I also share critiques of it, which, you know, come out particularly on the people that I respect and follow on Twitter. They share it, and I always share those. But I agree with you. There's no perfect solution. And there is definitely a way, and this is also something that's interesting, there's a way to recognize the importance of this while being fair in the critiques. And that's okay. Because people are like, oh, that's terrible, you're being so negative. I'm like, no, because this is my experience. And coming from, you know, marginalized communities and the ones that don't necessarily get amplified, I think it's really important to be able to do that. And like your show is really important, like that you're talking about it openly and talking about the work you do. It's not easy at all. Like the amount of labor it takes is a lot to even talk about it. The panel that we talked about meeting, that was the first place I had ever said publicly that I had struggled with anxiety. It was the first place I'd ever said that. And now it's become so much easier. And now like, you know, to sort of talk about it triggered by imposter syndrome sometimes that I deal with or whatever else. When we're talking about athletes, I tore my ACL, my anterior cruciate ligament, about 4 years ago. And I got a lot of sympathy on my crutches. You know, it's a sports injury. Are you okay? Can we do anything to help? But it was like a very visible thing, right? And people could see and empathize. And on that issue of compassion that you mentioned, if we could only do that with mental health and extend that compassion, because you don't wear a bandage, you don't, when you struggle with mental health. And I know so many people that suffer quietly and they don't have to. And it also has a lot to do with, I feel the way that sports media is not only consumed, but it's shared. The way that people write about it and don't have the expertise to do it, or it's lazy journalism, basically, is what I'm saying. And just so they use words lackadaisically, or don't sort of temper, or it's not a nuanced piece, and it's sort of just rushed in the way that they talk about it. Like the way that someone talks about something is as important as the topic itself, and using language, and people can learn from you. Like what you do is educate. And so I don't understand, like, you know, I'll be on Twitter and saying, I think every sports editor should really follow you on Twitter and learn from your work. And this, honestly, because there's ways to talk about it that are helpful, and there's just ways to make noise. And that gets into the compassion piece. Are we really being genuine in our conversations about this? Are we listening to what those athletes are really saying about which is why Kevin Love's piece was so important, because it was going to reach a lot of people. And the words that he was using were his own experience. As much as I would love people to read, you know, Imani McGee Stafford and Silken Lauman and, you know, other, you know, women and non-binary folks that have talked about it, or LGBTQ representatives, or not representatives, but community folks, that's really important. I mean, we'll get into that, into the to-do list that we're going to talk about at the end of the show. I have some suggestions on that. I have some work people got to do some work here.
Oh yeah. I like it. I like it. Assigning homework. I'm into it.
Yeah, totally. Do the work.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple times, and I really appreciate you mentioning, you know, some of your own struggles with mental health, and you've got a lot like going on in your life. You know, you're a sports writer, you're a public speaker, you've got your podcast, you've got, you know, you're a parent, you've got like so much going on. So how do you you've mentioned coffee a couple of times, but how else do you,
cheers,
how do you kind of manage your own mental health kind of through that? How do you make your mental health a priority?
Well, I'm very fortunate to have like a family care physician who is super attentive and super compassionate. And I mean, it's something simple as like breathing exercises. And also, this is something that I've sort of come to deal with like later in my early 40s. And just the stigma around medication is because I used to be like, oh, I don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to take that. And sometimes, even if I choose not to, that's fine for me. But even unwrapping around that everyone's experience is very different, and everyone, like, healing is not linear.
Yeah.
Like a friend of mine, her name is Frizz. Her work name is Frizz Kid Art, and she does motivational and sort of healing artwork around a lot of mental health issues and social justice issues. And she's one of the things that I do. Those affirmation art is what it's called, and the one that she has is healing is not linear. Really stuck with me because what my experience and sort of survival will look like is very different than someone else's. So a lot of breathing, like I'm a practicing observant Muslim, so I pray. I find that meditation really important for me in centering because I really need it. And it's like alone time with me, and I can sort of be in that moment and be like, okay. And I know my symptoms when I start to get anxious. I start feeling panicky. I know the tension that crawls up my shoulders. I know that my throat gets dry. I know my fingers get sweaty. I know I literally start fidgeting with the digits of my fingers. Like I can feel it swell up in me. That's what it's like for me. And then to calm, I also phone a friend. My phone is like immediate, and I'm really lucky that I have people that will respond immediately. I remember being on the, like, literally in training to a panic attack and calling 12 people, but the 12th person picked up the phone. Yeah. Just coincidentally, there was 11 people for whatever reason were not available. I kept going and I kept going. And to know that I have that support is really, really, like, I'm very, very fortunate, and I'm cognizant of that, that I have those people to be able to say, okay. And I often refer to that group as my lady army. That is very, because, when you go through personal challenges in life, and I'm, undergoing that as well, the significant personal changes, it's that having that support is really crucial. And also people that say, if you need to cry this out, you cry it out. If you need to react in a way, as long as it's safe for you and you're in a safe space, do what you got to do. We'll support you. Like, hearing those words from those people is huge for me. I also have the self-care practice. I'll watch, like, Bend It Like Beckham over. I'll put myself in a happy place. I need to be, reminded to eat. Sometimes, like, I forget to eat. Like, you're just busy managing. Yeah. You're like, oh wow, 12 hours have gone by and I haven't eaten anything, and that affects me as well, right? So in terms of managing, like, I'm also in a place where I can be, sometimes if I need to step back, I'll step back. But not everybody's in those positions, right? Not everybody has the opportunity. Like, you've got to get up. I don't have a choice. I have to get up. I'm a mom of 4 kids. I have to get up. And then my cat, like, I basically am absolutely subservient to my cat and her needs. So you have to keep going. And some days you don't want to, you really don't want to, but you put one foot in front of the other. And I'm visual, and I'm audio in my learning. So affirmation art is a really big thing for me, seeing little encouraging people send me beautiful memes, over WhatsApp, and little pictures, or, and with the work I do, because of the subjects that I talk about, there's a fair amount, and we talked about this on our panel, there's a fair amount of abuse that gets thrown at us, and how we manage that, because that also ties in very directly to how I'm doing. You wake up and you're like, oh, rape threat, amazing. Oh, I'm going to report you to Homeland Security. Oh, that's a nice email. Like, you wake up and you see these, right? And it's like, okay, I'm going to manage that. And sometimes I use a lot of self-deprecation because that's how I deal with it. But not everybody is the same. And seeing other people have these conversations is really helpful for me. I'm in a couple of Facebook groups that are folks of color only, and women and non-binary identifying only, just for those spaces, those very sacred spaces where people can talk about it and reach out to each other. And it's like it's not a huge commitment. Like, you can go in and just post and be like, wow, I'm having a really awful day right now. I could just use some great vibes. I could use some love. I could use some positive energy. And then it's a quick thing. And then you get like 30, 40 people just sending you love. Yeah. And I feel it. Like, I'm like, oh, that's awesome. And you don't have to get into detail about the story. You don't have to share anything. You can just say, folks, I need some love right now. and they send it. So it's pretty magical. As much as, I have issues with Mark Zuckerberg. We talked about this. It opens communities up, and social media does that. So that's also how I deal.
Absolutely, especially, in with marginalized communities, especially in areas like Canada where we are geographically so spread out, right? Like being able to access other people with similar experiences who may be, halfway across the country or halfway across the world, but you are able to, again, post in that Facebook group, right? And feel that community where in, whether it's Whitecourt, Alberta, or even like, Fredericton's not exactly a bustling metropolis, right? Like, whereas in lots of other areas, geographically, that critical mass of people isn't there for us to have the same degree of community that we would have online.
And I think digitally, that's made a big difference, and social media has made a big difference because, those a girlfriend of mine and I were talking about this. She's in Montreal, and we were talking about, she's a grad student at the time, and her family is based in Toronto, but to find community, she found much of her community online. So all those folks saying, get off your phones and go out and enjoy nature and be in the moment. Like, so much of your support in your community is online. Like, I have friends that I've met since doing the work I do that are very dear and close to me. I've never met them in person. And they are real. They are wonderful, and they're my colleagues, and I love them, but we just haven't met in person, and they are a huge support system for me. But it just, like, this is something else, like in terms of coping, like you reach out to those that are dear to you. Doesn't matter what have you actually met each other, which hopefully we'll do. Like some of the Burn It All Down cast, for example. I haven't met Lindsay in person.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she's based in Washington. Like, we do our podcast like digitally. I've met, fortunately, everyone else, but Lindsay and I haven't met yet. She's the only one, and we're working on a plan to do that. She's also a really important person in my life. She's a close friend and she's a colleague, but that happens as well. You know what I mean? And when we talk about these conversations about mental health and everything, it's really important not to minimize and be reductive with how people cope. And a lot of people cope by using social media to reach out.
Absolutely. And I can't believe we are out of time, which I'm devastated about because this has gone by so quickly, and it's been so wonderful having you on the show. But if someone is, we talked about this a little bit earlier, so you've got some homework for us, Shireen. I would love to hear, what would you like anyone watching this show to kind of go out and do in the world following this episode?
Well, I think one of the first things is how you get your information is really important. I would always recommend, if people are on Facebook or on Snapchat or on Instagram, to follow people who have conversations. And when I say people, I'm specifically talking about people of color and LGBTIQ folks, persons with disabilities, because it's a different lens at which things are brought up and their voices that need to be amplified. That will always be my first. You don't always have to get your information from like an able-bodied cishet man, white man. You do not. And some of the other things are to support organizations that do, and I mean grassroots level ones, that like very local work is being done to help people in different communities. I know that there's a food bank really close to me that actually does a lot of work around mental health, because people that are, dealing with homelessness and poverty struggle with these issues. So something as simple as that, like women's shelters, like rape crisis centers, it's really easy. Like if you can't donate monetarily, you can donate your time. You can donate like whatever you can. You can go online and amplify someone's tweet who's talking about this, and pay attention to the conversations. That's some of the homework. Some of the other homework is to be careful how the words you use. Don't be ableist. It's really important to unlearn. Unlearning is crucial. Unlearn things that are not great. And it's not that difficult. Like, I grew up in Halifax in the early 80s without aging myself. There's a lot of language that I literally had to shed because I didn't know how bad it was, but it's bad. And I had to have somebody say to me, you need to stop saying this because it's hurtful and it's offensive. So if someone says to you, that's like a problematic, you can't be like, oh, it's too politically correct. No. Unlearn it. Stop using it. Do not be an asshole. It's very simple. So those are some of the to-dos, and also be aware. And we talk about compassion, right? Just a little bit of that goes a long way.
Yeah, Absolutely. Okay. I think that sounds like fabulous homework. So Shireen, thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in. A couple of people have left comments, which I'm going to get to at the end of the show because we didn't quite have time to address them during this show, but that's okay. So everyone who tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in. If you are watching this episode of Crazy Talk and you're going, wow, this is fantastic. I would like to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. Then you can sign up for my mailing list and I'll put a link to that in the comments. Other than that, I hope everyone has a great Saturday. Shireen, again, thank you so much for joining us, and join us next week, everyone, when I will be interviewing Brian King. That'll be next Saturday at 12:30 Atlantic. Thanks so much, and I will see you all next week.